Well, I'd like to thank everyone for our very first multidisciplinary cybersecurity lecture series. We're very excited about this, and the real purpose of this is to broaden the outreach of cybersecurity and the issues of national security across all of the colleges of the university. And for that particular case, we wanted to reach out to areas that are familiar in terms of the law, governance, ethics, criminal justice, human, behavioral, social sciences, anthropology. I mean, all fields need to understand where cybersecurity plays into that, and it's an important role, whether you're going into government, academia, or industry. It'll kind of follow us for the rest of our lives, and even more than we want to sometimes. So it's really my great privilege to introduce our very first speaker, Edward McAndrew. Ed is a partner in the Privacy and Data Security, Litigation, and Investigations groups at Ballard Spahr LLP in Washington, Wilmington, and Philadelphia. He has a very rich background, so it's really a pleasure to have Ed as our first speaker. Recently, he was named a cybersecurity and data privacy trailblazer by the National Law Journal. He helps organizations and individuals navigate this digital world. He advises clients on cybersecurity, digital privacy, cyber incident response, national security issues, digital speech and conduct, corporate governance, regulatory compliance, and enforcement. The reason he's so good at this, prior to this, Mr. McAndrew served for nearly a decade as a federal cybercrime prosecutor in the U.S. Attorney's Office for the districts of Delaware and Eastern District of Virginia, so a lot of experience. His team was part of the Delaware-based prosecutors that secured the first prosecution for a cyberstalking event that resulted in a death, and actually for the shooting of 4 people in the Newcastle courthouse years ago. And prior to that, he was the U.S. Department of Justice. Mr. McAndrew was a litigation partner and deputy practice group leader in Washington, D.C. at the Office of Reed Smith. Academically, he was a graduate of the College of New Jersey, cum laude, and Catholic University as a J.D., magna cum laude. So it's a really great pleasure to introduce Ed, and again, once you help me welcome him to the podium.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I've got a mic on here. I think it's picking up okay, so I'm not stranded behind a podium. As a trial lawyer, I'm now allergic to podiums because judges often make you stand behind podiums. So anytime I don't have to stand behind a podium, I'm not going to. Well, thank you for that very nice welcome. As Dr. Walker said, I've been involved in the cyber world for, you could say, some time now. It used to seem that 10 years was an eternity. Now that I'm in my 40s, 10 years doesn't seem like quite so long anymore. But I come at these issues from really 2 perspectives. One being the perspective of business, of the private sector. I went to the Department of Justice 10 years into my law career after being a partner in a large corporate law firm in Washington. So for me, I went into it with that sort of background at a time that the cyber wave was really beginning to gather. And I've been able to bear witness to many of the evolving threats that we've seen over the past decade. I want to talk to you about those threats. I don't know within the audience, what your level of knowledge or information is about the cyber threat landscape, the issues that are arising. So we're going to go through a lot of material probably in a short amount of time. So we'll get to it. And then at the end, we'll save some time to ask questions. I'm happy to stay and answer questions for as long as you want to ask them. So with that said, we'll move into it. What's driving this? What's driving this is a transformation of our daily lives. We're living our lives online. And the notion of a physical life and a virtual life and some great divide between them is really a false one at this point, because we've seen a melding of these 2 worlds. And there really aren't 2 worlds anymore. So those are just some basic statistics. I won't walk through them. Hopefully you'll have these slides available to you afterwards, because some of them are truly pretty startling. That there are 284,000 snaps per minute. Amazon's making a gajillion dollars, as is Netflix, on and on and on, not to mention Apple. But it creates the perfect cybercrime storm, because you have great connectivity, enormous amounts of data that's just growing day by day, and an open network or system that's really not built with security in mind. So it creates the perfect storm for cyber issues. In terms of crime, when we talk about cyber crime, and it's important to remember that a lot of these issues aren't criminal at all. A lot of these issues involve just unintentional conduct that results in the exposure of data in ways that it shouldn't be exposed, lost devices, things of that nature. So while the hacking threat is first and foremost on the list, it is far from the only threat that we face in the cyber world. But when we look at the major areas of technology-facilitated crime, we're talking about hacking and data theft. And when we're talking about data theft, we're not just talking about the exposure of identities that you hear so much about in the media, with the Target breach and the Home Depot breach and the Ashley Madison breach and the OPM breach and on and on. That's certainly a major component of this. But why are we hearing so much about those incidents? Well, first, they're newsworthy, right? Second, they involve a lot of people. They involve big companies. But there are laws that require the notification be made in certain instances where personally identifiable information about individuals is exposed. So you're hearing about what folks are required to tell you about. But there's a lot more going on that you're not hearing about. That includes things like the massive amount of intellectual property theft, fraud and corruption. Something that is now number 2, I think it's knocked fraud down, in my view, to number 3. The disruption and destruction of networks, the disruption and alteration of ongoing business operations. So we're moving from a world where the main cyber threat that we saw was one of spying and stealing to one that also includes disruption and destruction. And that is extremely concerning. This isn't just an issue, though, for organizations with computer networks. We're dealing also with extortion, online bullying, stalking, and threats. Cybercrime has a personal dimension, whether it is focused on organizations or whether it's focused on the individual. Because in many instances, even when it's focused on the organization, the attack vector is through the individual. And I'll explain what I mean by that in a minute. But obstruction of justice and tampering, there's now so many ways to engage in misconduct. Terrorism. The new front in the war on terror is online. We see it with radicalization, recruitment, planning, communications. We see things like the use of online gaming platforms as communication devices for terrorist cells. Things that, make you kind of go, no one ever really thought about that one before. Online child exploitation, an epidemic that we're not going to touch on today, a subject in and of itself, but yet another area of major concern in technology-facilitated crime. And street crime, violent crime, any crime, because every crime is now a technology-facilitated or provable crime, right? I don't have my phone on me, but somebody hold one of those phones up, right? You got a phone? That's not a phone, it's a witness. It's the best witness the government can get. It has a long, near-perfect memory and no bias. And that's something that's changed. In the 21st century courtroom, humans corroborate devices in the presentation of evidence. It's no longer the case that I've got somebody who has terrible credibility, who's trying to get out of jail, trying to save him or herself, has committed a million crimes, and is in there making up a story about what happened. Now we're talking about devices telling stories and humans filling in the blanks. Sea change, right? And it fits perfectly with CSI. It fits perfectly with what jurors expect. They want to understand the forensics of an iPhone. So you're meeting their expectations at the same time that you're presenting a quantum of evidence that, quite frankly, early in my career, I could have only dreamed about. When I was a young lawyer doing investigations, I learned from some very good lawyers that you create chronologies of events. Well, we used to have very limited data sets in order to create those chronologies. We now create chronologies with data set after data set after data set, all overlaid, where we're able to show behavior, location, associations, communications, activities, down to 1/10 of a second. It's absolutely fascinating, and it really helps when you're trying to prove something beyond a reasonable doubt. So who are the good guys in the cyber fight? The Department of Justice, my old home, a place that's very near and dear to my heart. I do have children to put through college, so I couldn't stay there forever. But I did stay for a decade, which for many people in my line of work is forever. So I would just want to walk you through what's called, in the department, we've got a CHIP network, a computer hacking and intellectual property crimes network. They're the prosecutors who focus on these issues every day. At the risk of scaring you, there are about 300 of them for the country. So we've got America covered with about 300 people. Go home, get a good night's sleep, don't worry. The National Security Cyber Specialist Network is composed of about 120 prosecutors. These are prosecutors, and I was one of them, who bridge a divide between the law enforcement world and the intelligence community, a divide between investigations that are conducted using traditional criminal investigative tools like grand juries, subpoenas, and whatnot, and investigations that are conducted through intelligence apparatus and tools. And we look for ways to make those worlds interact. And that's easier said than done. But it's something that is very important because the government is no longer just in the business of solving crimes, determining who did it, what happened, and what should happen as a result of something. Because we're not talking about spilled milk. We're talking about ongoing, advanced, persistent threats, cyber incidents that occur day after day after day, in fact, hour after hour after hour. So the government is now also in the business of threat mitigation. It's a national security business. It's an economic security business. It's a personal security business. And it's something that is critical to protecting our daily functioning. We're not alone. There are a lot of private entities and persons who are weighing in now on cyber threats. Companies are getting beat to the internet, to the media. They're being outed by journalists, by private investigative firms, security researchers, on and on and on, right? Individuals who are also not just reporting on what's happening, conducting their own investigations, and in many instances revealing information before the government does, or before the victims do. In a lot of instances, victims are learning of their victimization from third parties. Who are the bad guys? Spies, thieves, terrorists, warriors, hacktivists, insiders. It runs the gamut. And as I said, we're talking about people inside of organizations who can do great damage. We're talking about people in other countries who can do great damage. And we're talking about people who are acting on behalf of nation states, their agents, their affiliates, terrorist organizations. And we're talking about individuals who are acting on their own accord or in loose collectives of hacking groups, for instance. You used to think of a criminal, a criminal organization as the mafia, right? The 20th century mafia. Today they're more like collectives. Their motives shift, their alliances shift, sometimes on a daily basis. Their activities are blurred. Many of these people, many of these hackers have never met each other. They don't know where they are or who their names, what their real names are. So their affiliations and their allegiances are very, very different from that of your typical criminal group. Cyber threat to organizations. There are two types of big corporations in America, those that have been hacked and those who don't yet know they've been hacked. That's Director Comey's statement from 2014. I think we can amend it at this point to add that there are those that have been hacked and those that are being hacked again and again and again. So now we're creating not just single incidents or limited incidents, but a new daily reality of cyber attack across industry sectors. And it's getting much worse. 51% of CEOs reported in 2014 that their organizations were facing cyber attacks hourly or daily. The detected number of incidents soared to about 42, almost 43 million in 2014. The numbers I'm hearing for this year are somewhere north or around or north of 90 million incidents detected in the past year in the United States alone. The losses are growing up to the point where we're looking at $500 billion in losses to the U.S. economy per year from cyber incidents. So these numbers continue to mount, and with all due respect to Texas, everything's bigger on the internet. And this problem is getting much bigger. Recent study from the Association of Corporate Counsel, the largest of its kind survey of senior legal officers, general counsels and other senior legal officers in organizations, about 1,000 or over 1,000, or 887 organizations from 30 countries, a global study across 62 industry sectors, and everyone's getting hit over and over and over. Some really interesting statistics. 30% of these in-house lawyers have experienced a cyber incident, a breach, in the last 2 years. So this is a huge problem, a growing problem, but a very new problem. Employee error is cited as a top cause, and that might be malicious activity or unintentional activity, like a spear phishing campaign, for instance, where someone clicks on a link in an email that launches malware onto a network or onto a device. Reputational harm, the top concern for these lawyers. It's not money, it's not the government, it's brand, it's reputational harm. It's so much of the value in organizations is now caught up in their branding and their reputation, and so much hard work and effort can be lost in a nanosecond. User training and compliance, end users being the Achilles heel of cybersecurity, the manner and method in which organizations and their networks are infiltrated through their end users. So how do we train them better to have better cyber hygiene, to engage in better activity, to not click on those links necessarily that go to places that are going to serve as launching pads for viruses and malware. And it's not just about your organization, because every organization is connected to other organizations. They have vendors, they have people who control the lights and the heat and provide the services. And those networks connect to one another and trust one another. So the exploitation of one network can be used to pivot and violate the trust into that other network. So one victim begets another and another and another in a supply chain scenario. So we see that again and again. The need to respond for these attacks and these incidents in advance of their occurrence is critically important. Otherwise, it becomes the worst type of fire drill you've ever seen. What are the threats? Identity theft, I've already hit on it. A little tidbit about OPM. So I'm a former government employee. So what happens after OPM is breached? Well, you get an email. And the email says, we've lost your information, we're sorry. Here's a link. Click on this link and enter your full name, your date of birth, your social security number, all of your financial accounts, and we'll take care of the rest. It's funny, but it's not. But it's a sign of where we are in terms of, are we trusting that link? Are we trusting that email? Intellectual property theft. We're witnessing the greatest transfer of wealth in history. That's General Alexander, the former NSA director and head of Cyber Command. Absolutely the truth. And this is so much of what we see in the government that the public does not see, because there's no public reporting on this by and large. But you see things like the daily digital looting of American companies, and it's not just American companies, stealing things like our pharmaceuticals, technologies for hybrid vehicles, our technology companies being looted, consumer products, DuPont's Kevlar, information relating to our weapon systems and all of our national defense apparatus. The fact that the Chinese basically have a replica of every major weapon system that the United States has. How did that happen? The Great Brain Robbery. I don't know if any of you saw the 60-minute segment of a couple weeks ago, but if you haven't, you should check it out online. The Assistant Attorney General from the National Security Division went on 60 Minutes and made some very candid statements that had not previously been made. The fact that just the Chinese threat against American intellectual property interests alone has a national security dimension to it. That thousands of our companies have been hit. That this is going on a daily basis across industry sectors, anywhere that China sees an important component of their national strategic planning. So I would encourage you to watch it. I'm not going to play it now in the interest of time. Beyond IP theft, we're looking at espionage, deals, trades, before major mergers, during the negotiations. If you're international in scope, is your company being looted to see what the pressure points are, what the price points are for deals that is impacting negotiations for different types of things? Spying on U.S. law firms by foreign intelligence services. Think about how much information a law firm has that's of value. They're sort of like the Target or Walmart of information. And they're in the secrets business. They're in the security business and the confidence business. So for them to have major cyber issues and staring down the battle of a nation state or a foreign intelligence service is a very significant problem and a new one. Cyber extortion, harassment, and destruction. Sony, the Sony cyber attack. The government has been concerned for years that we would see a destructive attack on a major American corporation. We just never thought it would be against a movie studio for a bad movie. And that tells you something about shifting objectives in cyber attacks. That's not about money. That's about a political agenda. It's about an ideological agenda, right? So we see that now, and it's much more appalling. Saudi Aramco was an attack on the world's largest oil producer some years ago that bricked 30,000 computers on that network with the goal of disrupting global oil production. It didn't succeed, but it was a good attempt. Sony. The CIO of Sony, who was unable to get in contact with other senior executives on the morning of the attack, made the decision to pull the plug on Sony's network about 40 minutes in, after the the end unit started shutting down. In that amount of time, 60% of Sony's computer network was destroyed. They had an incident response plan for cyber attacks. It was on the network they couldn't access. In terms of communicating with people, you go to, how many people have numbers memorized at this point? Nobody memorizes phone numbers anymore, do they? No, you just pull it up in your device. Of course, that's on a Microsoft Exchange server, so those contacts aren't actually sitting on your device. So what happens when that Exchange server goes down? You can't even call anybody. So they're reduced to pad and paper in terms of their activities. Ashley Madison, I'm going to leave that one alone. Another good example of shifting tactics and objectives in cyber attacks, though, that one was not about money. That's the screen that the Sony employees saw when they logged in. That's another screen that you don't want to see when you log in. But the idea being that destruction and disruption of ongoing business operations is a new front in this area that's very, very concerning. Sony's also interesting because the destruction comes after the digital looting occurs. So they burn the bridges on the way out of town, but they've already taken out all the valuable information that they want. And it's not just consumer identities. And it's not just intellectual property or the script for the next great movie, right? It's stuff like how much each employee is paid. So this is information that when released, it has great value to Sony because it's confidential. It has great value to the employees who are going, oh, I didn't know she was making that much. It had great value to Angelina Jolie, who was so wronged by those comments about her acting talent. But the point being is that this information has great value within organizations, even though it's not the type of information that might constitute the crown jewels, right? It has value because of its confidential nature. It can be exploited. Another thing that's really interesting about Sony is it's not just an attack on computers. It's an attack on individuals. It's the outing of the emails in a searchable WikiLeaks database for the C-suite, for the general counsel, right? Among others, other in-house counsels. Think about the information, legal and business strategies for Sony, an email purge directive from the general counsel's office telling people to get rid of stuff, litigation strategy for major pieces of litigation the company's involved in. Their dealings in a Foreign Corrupt Practices Act investigation, a very hot area of anti-corruption law right now that's international in scope. Their budgeting data, how much they were spending on different legal issues. The general counsel, that one got cut off, briefing to the board of directors on Sony's cybersecurity preparedness, coming 1 month before the attack. Now going to be front and central in lawsuits against the board, against the corporation, as to whether they were adequately prepared for this type of an attack. A particular focus on data security matters, right? How they handled prior incidents, how they were going to deal with hacktivists who kept hitting the PlayStation network. Cyber war and terrorism. Sony's a bit of that, right? But more than that, we're seeing this around the world now. A recent incident where Ukraine's electricity grid went down because of a reported hack. Whether that's tied back to Russia or not, who knows? The allegations were made that it was, but this is a new front in warfare. The cyber dimension is incredibly important. We see it in the government. We see it on the civilian side of the government. If the United States is beginning to prepare for potential activity, military activities, those of us back here have to be prepared for cyber blowback because we're fighting an asymmetrical threat. Countries that may not be able to meet us on the battlefield or in the air may be able to inflict harm on our interests, public or private, in the digital realm. And that's a new reality that we have to deal with. Data exploitation, not just taking something from somebody else and selling it for what it's worth, but using that information to generate money in different ways. So say instead of getting into the networks of major corporations to find out what deals they're about to do, you go down the supply chain to the media companies that send out all of their press releases. And you read those press releases a day before they go out. And you pass that information on to a lot of people, or a group of people, who are going to go trade on that information, or going to make investments based on that information, right? That's the new face of insider trading. And this is something that happened to the tune of about $100 million in ill-gotten gains over 5 years. So these are individuals that maintained access to these networks for over 5 years without being detected. Individuals who passed that information off to others who made trades in such a way that did not trip anti-fraud algorithms in the markets. So it's a very, very sophisticated crime. And I got to tell you, when we started hearing about this, there's part of you that's going, that's horrible, and there's another part of you that's going, that's brilliant. Like, no one had even thought about that before. But that's a great example of what we're dealing with now. We're dealing with conduct that we haven't seen before, and it's really hard to prepare for the things that you haven't seen before, right? Just ask Cam Newton. He had that issue this past week. So sorry for you Carolina fans, but business email compromises. Not all of this is complicated. We have seen both here in Delaware and around the country a tremendous amount of fraud through what we call spoofed emails. Emails that look legitimate and say, you know, like we did last week, we've got to do this deal and the closing funds need to be wired and here are the instructions for wiring the money and just click on this link and it'll take you to the account and send it through. The problem is that link doesn't go where it's supposed to go. And this is a combination of both inside information and some really good social engineering and guesswork on the part of fraudsters. But it's a relatively simplistic problem that is plaguing many, many businesses right now. The anatomy of a hack. I just want to walk you through a case that we did here in Delaware that involved the infiltration of about 50 different technology companies in the consumer product sphere. And I believe I cemented my place in my 8-year-old son's mind when I told him that I was engaged in an effort to save the Xbox. To save the Xbox One before the secret plans, before it was released, were stolen. And one of the defendants in the case went by the nick Xenon, which is a really good sounding name. So we called Xenon the greatest criminal mastermind the world had ever known. Xenon was captured on a bridge over Niagara Falls with the secrets to the Xbox in his hand and one question in his mind. Does he throw it or not? And the 8-year-old boys are going. So, great case. Illustrates a lot of key points. So I'll walk you through just quickly the anatomy of a hack. And this assumes that they're in. Okay, so they get in by stealing credentials or sending a spear phishing email that launches malware that vacuums up the credentials for everybody. And then they use real credentials to go into the network, and these networks believe that they're being accessed in a permissible way. It's really that easy. The most valuable stuff on the market is not your credit card number. Your personal health information is much more valuable. But some of the most valuable stuff on the market are your usernames and passwords because they are the keys to the kingdoms. And a lot of people reuse them. So looking at this, stolen credentials, right? All these different accounts pulled into a database. Now, I'm going to illustrate a point for you. That is the victim's password. They used it on every single account that was hacked. So during the course of this investigation, we capture a hacker, and of course we encounter encrypted drives, and we say, well, you're cooperating, so that's great. We just need you to give us your password so we can see what's in this drive that you have. So we asked him for his password, and this is what we get. Now, I want you to take a second and think about your password. Words, because you're all using multiple passwords, right? But that's the kind of thing that I think is really, really illustrative when you talk to hackers about their data security. We find multiple instances where they take much greater pains and put forth much greater effort to protect the information they stole than the people did that they stole it from. And that tells you something. There's a lot to be learned in that lesson. What are they trying to get to on a network? They're trying to get to something called root access. They're trying to get the broadest access to the network that they can get. And who's the person or types of people who have the greatest access to networks? Administrators, right? People with administrative privileges. And root access, you might think of it like this: a parent directory with a folder for every employee on the network. And you can go into any of them and you can get anything in them. That's root access. So that's what they're driving for. But they want to move laterally across it to find additional credentials. So in this slide, you see them actually going from one network that linked to Apple's development network on something called the secret server through the IT department. It's actually called the secret server, not so secret in this instance. And they can go in and change the usernames or passwords for different accounts, thereby giving them access through other people's accounts to other networks. Compromising personal and professional accounts. How many people in here at work access their personal accounts or on their mobile devices are accessing both business and personal stuff? Come on, put your hands up. You know you're doing it. All right. Quick example for you of yanking the Google chain. This poor senior executive used Google Chrome and saved all those passwords and usernames. So you don't have to remember them. You know how the computer asks you to do that? So one thing hackers like to do is they go right to that, and they get every account that person has and the username and password. Completely hosed, completely compromised at that point, right? Establishing network control, going into a Barracuda server and changing firewall settings to set up backdoors that allow them to get back into networks or to maintain access, because that's what they really need, is to be able to maintain access. Because when you get into a new network, let's face it, it's going to take you a while to look around and find some really good stuff. It's going to take you even longer to figure out how to get it out of there without getting caught. And there's new stuff every day, so you got to come back. Stealing code from an Army server. This is an example of compromising one victim in order to get to another. All you're seeing here, and I know these are difficult to see, I'm just using them as examples. They're jumping from, they're going through a VPN tunnel of one company that's performing as a government contractor for the Army, and are able to get into an Army server and steal stuff relating to gaming software that's being used to train Apache pilots. You know, so there's a hack into the Department of Defense through a government contractor. That's a very common scenario, believe it or not. And it's not just about stealing that information, because as they're stealing it, he's also writing, hey, I should run some crazy program to mess up the fans on the server. So now they're talking about altering the fan speed on the servers that they're attacking. So not only are they going to steal the data off of it, they're going to burn them up on the way out the door. This is what I'm talking about when I'm talking about destruction. And these threats aren't just to computers. Here's an instance where we had a hacker on the run who was basically saying, if they don't leave me alone, I'm going to unleash what we call, he set what's called a dead man switch. I'm going to drop onto the network for the hacking community about 1.7 terabytes of source code that we've stolen from the victim companies. Source code that could be used to create malware. Source code that could be used to exploit virtual currency platforms. Source code that could be used in many ways. So you've got a major company pleading with us to do something to stop this from happening. The problem is this guy's in Australia, and we just can't go to Australia and say, hey, you, stop. This is an international problem that requires a lot of international collaboration and attention. The Internet of Things, what's on the horizon? I just want to highlight this quickly. We're no longer talking about desktops and laptops and tablets. We're talking about cars. By 2020, it's estimated the estimates range widely, but it could be anywhere from 25 billion to 60 billion things connected to the internet. Our watches, our refrigerators, our alarm systems, our TVs, our cars. A tremendous amount of additional data and connection points and interconnected and interdependent relationships that can be exploited. And that's going to continue to grow, and it's going to create new issues like hacking cars. If you look at the car commercials, do you see how prevalent now or prominent the technology features are? The entertainment features are in cars? It's all great stuff, hugely convenient, really cool. Also a bit of a security issue. So we're going to see more and more of that as this race to digitize and connect continues. And it's spreading to areas like planes, drones, and automobiles. I tried to make a planes, trains, and automobiles, but I'm not worried about train hacking. That's an issue, but drones are actually a bigger issue. So planes, drones, and automobiles, medical devices, internet protocol-enabled cameras. There's actually been a case that the FTC brought dealing with internet-connected cameras so you could watch that little bundle of joy in the crib from your mobile device. The problem was hackers infiltrated that network and were actually able to appear via webcam on the screens of the baby monitors in the rooms. They were actually able to monitor the babies as they slept. Now, why anybody wants to do that, I don't know. But, you know, home security systems and issues with them, HVAC and physical control systems. We've seen instances of hackers taking over the cameras, the security cameras inside of buildings, being able to reprogram the door codes. So now we're talking about moving from virtual to physical security, geolocational tracking. How much of that is going on? As I told you, those things in your pockets aren't phones. They're witnesses. They're trackers. You call them government, you know, I call them government trackers. You might call them, you know, your Apple iWatch. But they're tracking movements. And it's not just the government that's doing that, because the government's often doing it with process for good reason on a showing of probable cause. What about all of these private organizations that are gathering this data and exploiting it and using it in ways that maybe you're not even aware of? Cybersecurity is now a board of directors level issue. I want to touch on this because we're in Delaware, and that's what we touch on when we're in Delaware. But within the last couple of years alone, there has been a tremendous focus on the needs for boards of directors to be engaged in, to be knowledgeable about, and to be responsive to cybersecurity issues within their organizations. To the point where some boards are actually beginning to employ cybersecurity experts, have committees that might be focused on cybersecurity preparedness and response. There are a number of guiding principles. I won't bore you with them. They're in the slides. But the idea being that directors have to view cyber risk just as they view any other business risk. And they have to engage in the same type of risk assessment and risk management planning processes that they do in other aspects of the business. And there are various controls in place that can implicate that. We're really at the beginning of this. This is the beginning of an evolution. This is in its infancy. Where this is going to lead in terms of board liability, responsibility, remains to be seen. But I can tell you, having moved back into the private sector, that this is something that is on everyone's agenda. And if it's not on your agenda, you've got a big problem because it's supposed to be. So now we have the development of these frameworks that are being used by organizations to assess risk, to engage in risk management planning. NIST is part of the Department of Commerce. It's just one of the frameworks that's available. It draws on a lot of others that I won't bore you with. But one of the issues we're seeing is, you know, there are lots of different frameworks. And one of the problems that organizations are running into is which framework do they need to be using? Because they're not all necessarily the same. They have differences. Is it all right to comply with one but not another? And will these frameworks be used as standards that you will be judged against for purposes of liability in a regulatory sphere, in private litigation, in terms of your activities with your vendors and your business partners? So those are all real concerns as organizations are using the frameworks and the standards to try to improve cybersecurity. I've touched on vendor management a bit, and it's a really important point because it's not just about you, it's about your supply chain. And focusing on your own cybersecurity now requires you to focus on the cybersecurity of all of those with whom you interact in the business process. So if you're buying widgets from Acme Company, you need to be concerned about your digital interactions with Acme Company and their data security. If you're a law firm that's engaged in litigation, and you need to not only be concerned about securing your client's data in your network, you need to be worried about what's going to happen to that data when it goes to your e-discovery vendor, or when you produce it to your opponent in a case. Is it secure in that environment? Regulatory expectations. The SEC is becoming increasingly active. There's an entire federal alphabet soup of regulators who are staking a claim in cybersecurity. And it varies by the industry. These are just some examples about the SEC statements on securities-related issues, the materiality of cybersecurity issues to organizations, board governance issues, but it goes well beyond the SEC. You're talking about the Department of Justice, of course, on the law enforcement front, but the FTC, the Health and Human Services in the healthcare sphere, the FCC with communications, the SEC. And it's not just about federal regulators. You have the state attorneys general who are regulators of consumer privacy within their states. And they are heavily focused on these issues from a consumer privacy front. And that's just in the United States. Then you've got to deal with foreign governments. In the news this week, we've been hearing about the new Privacy Shield negotiations between the EU and the United States that deals with the transfer of personally identifiable data back and forth between the US and Europe, and how that actually is being impacted by national security matters. The Snowden revelations were used as a basis for invalidating the safe harbor framework that had been used for many, many years. So these issues find an interconnectedness that may not be readily apparent at the outset. Even in Delaware, the Delaware Supreme Court was the first court to adopt changes to the ethical rules that govern lawyers dealing with data security and technological competence in the practice of law. I'm on the court's Commission on Law and Technology. One of my early tasks was to develop leading practices, best practices in data security for lawyers. So this is now an issue for many, many industries that maybe typically weren't regulated in this way. Mergers and acquisitions, I touched on that before, but no, actually I didn't, but I mean, so it's not just about attacks. In your deal making, in your business planning, you need to be thinking about what risk are you taking on. If you buy a company, for instance, you know, is their cybersecurity mature? What's the level of maturity? What are the risks that they face? What might you be buying in the M&A process? Prioritizing risks, I'm going to blow through this, but there's a lot of business planning that's going on in terms of assessing risk, prioritizing it, understanding the types of threats that you face, understanding your compliance requirements with regard to regulations at various levels, understanding the operational and business consequences of what you might face. You know, from a reputational point of view, a legal point of view, a business point of view, on and on and on. Incident response. I talked about the fire drill before. One of the keys that I've seen over and over again is that organizations that have been through the ringer a couple times are better prepared to deal with cyber incidents. It takes a multidisciplinary team. You need information security and information technology professionals. You need lawyers. You need crisis managers. You need human HR folks inside of organizations to deal with the employment-related issues. Because you're not just dealing with an impact on consumers, you're dealing with an impact within your organization as well. So there's a lot of that. How you respond to incidents. Have you practiced in advance? This is very much like game planning or war game planning, where you're actually going through exercises now in how you're going to respond to particular types of incidents. The government has produced best practices for victim response. So we could talk about the organizational threat all day. We've got a few minutes left, and I want to touch on personal cybersecurity as well. We had a case here in Delaware that some of you may be familiar with. It involved the murder of 2 women in the Newcastle County Courthouse in February 2013. That was an active shooter situation. It resulted in the murder of 2 women and the shooting of 2 police officers before the shooting ended. As we looked at that situation, the initial reaction was, well, shooter's dead, it's over. But as we started digging into it, looking at different bits of evidence, writings, activities, online account content, on and on, we began to see a web of involvement from a number of family members that were focused on this objective of repossessing 3 young girls that had been at the center of a custody dispute for a number of years. And this action actually followed an international parental kidnapping where David Matusiewicz, an optometrist from Newark, and his mother kidnapped the 3 children under the theory that they were going to take them to Disney World on vacation. They left the United States. They were found 19 months later in Nicaragua on the side of a road after we traced email communications and wires, financial wires, from the sister who was still located up here to them in Nicaragua, which gave away their location. They came back. They were brought back by the U.S. Marshals, went to jail, and their campaign against the mother of these 3 young children continued. The children were reunited with their mother. And they harassed her relentlessly. They demonized her. They accused her of sexually abusing her kids, which is about the worst thing you can say about a mother. And they did this with the goal of getting her to give up, to give these kids back, to just push her to the point where she didn't want to fight anymore. It was 21st century domestic violence. It was stalking. It was harassing. And when that didn't work, when she fought back and went to court to terminate his parental rights while he sat in federal prison, they moved to a new phase. They moved to a phase of gathering information about her and the children. They had moved, they had relocated, following their daily activities, learning about all of those who were around them, and then using that information in a way that they hoped to reclaim the children from her, peacefully if they could. But if they couldn't, and it became clear to them that they couldn't, it became an act of murder in our largest courthouse. And they killed the person they hated the most in the place they hated the most, because they were also at war with the Delaware judicial system, which they believe had repeatedly failed them. That's the scene of the courthouse door on the morning of the shooting. The indictment was against the father of the children, the maternal grandmother, and the maternal aunt, the surviving members of the family. It was the first cyberstalking resulting in death conviction in the United States for the 3 surviving family members. The victims, as I said, were the mother of the children, her 4 children, the 3 who were kidnapped and 1 other, and unfortunately, the mother's best friend who happened to be with her that day, for support of court, but who had no connection to these people whatsoever. Cyberstalking is exactly what it sounds like. Using technology to engage in spying, stalking, harassment. It can take so many different forms. One of the things that was unique about our case is we found a way to take that conduct and link it to the death of this woman at the hands of somebody who was not charged in the case. And that's what was unique. To show that there was a causal connection between the cyber conduct, the technology facilitated conduct, and the ultimate murder. To prove a murder case without charging a murder. And that's what was unique about it. So I went through that quickly. There's an example of one of the websites they put up claiming that the mother had been abusing her children. They had eyes on them and video recordings that they would put on YouTube claiming that she was abusing the children. It wasn't just about the mother being victimized. This is the 4th grade. The 4th grader, Laura is her name as we call her now. That's not her name anymore. She Googled herself when she was in 4th grade with a friend. And that's when she first learned of the things that they were saying about her. Think back to the first time you Googled yourself, right? What's the world know about me? What does the world say about me? Who am I in the digital world? Imagine if that's the results that you got. I'm a victim. My own mother abuses me. And imagine if you're learning that with your 4th grade classmates. That's what these kids went through, and that was just part of it. It's a picture of them that was stolen because David engaged in an affair with somebody who Christine Belford was Facebook friends with. So even though Christine had taken measures to lock down her Facebook page to try to be secure and private, she was betrayed by somebody who was within her network, right? And this was a picture of the victims that we used at the closing, during the closing argument. But it shows you the level that people will go through to gather that sort of information in an online environment, and how your trust can really be exploited. This, of course, moved from the virtual world to the physical world. And 5 months after David Matusiewicz was released from custody in Texas, unable to travel, he created a scheme that resulted in him being given permission to travel here for a court hearing that he manufactured. And that is what gave the probation office reason to believe that they had to allow him to come. He and his parents, unbeknownst to the probation officers who were supervising him, piled into 2 cars full of weapons, ammunition. This is just some of the stuff that was found in the vehicles, and drove up here. Was the victim afraid? That's something you have to prove in a cyberstalking case, that the activities actually result in fear. So we could take things like an email sent on February 5th saying, David's on his way to Wilmington, I just found out. And then we could run it against web browsing history on a mobile device to show that within minutes of learning that, the victim was conducting searches for spiritual warfare prayers and deliverance, praying with authority, protecting yourself from evil. St. John the Beloved, dying prayers, prayers for a deceased mother or father. This was a woman we found through digital evidence was telling everybody who would listen that they were going to kill her. This is a woman who predicted her own death. And that is truly frightening, but thankfully something that we were able to prove beyond a reasonable doubt because of digital evidence. These are just some of the instances of foreseeability that we used. We had to show that there was a foreseeable connection, that their conduct, they could foresee or should have foreseen that their conduct would result in her death. Lenore, the maternal grandmother, writing about a visit where Tom Matusiewicz, the shooter, was going to visit with Laura and her psychiatrist. Tom has to be extra careful and good and remember not to call Christine the whore bitch. That's the name they used for her. And don't touch her, please. She cannot keep them, the kids, at all costs. Tom writing to Amy Gonzalez about the measures they were going to have to take to prevent her from keeping the kids. We must drink to the whore bitch's final day as well when we meet again. It's always good when criminals keep a lot of written evidence. It's very helpful to prove what's in their head. I had been told she should have killed the bitch, or mom had been told she should have killed the bitch when she had the chance by a good friend, but couldn't do it. Kidnapping to get them to safety was a second choice. This was all extremely powerful evidence that we were able to use. A poem found in their house. God, give me the strength to hide the bodies of those people I had to kill because they pissed me off. It goes on and on. They operated very much like a terrorist cell. Religious-themed scripture quotes that they would twist to support their activities. The millstone, anyone who should offend a child should be thrown into the ocean with a millstone around their neck. That was something they shared. Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord. But we are made in his image, aren't we? This was one of the last emails before they killed her. Think about how powerful that is. That's digital evidence that you can use. And this is just handwritten stuff, but it's great. We can end this BS now. It's up to Dave. That's Dad writing to Amy in his suicide note, where he had provided her with the VA book because he was a Navy veteran, and he had planned out his funeral on his computer before he left. It's not just about stalking like that, though. Think about the revenge pornography situations that we see, where people's private photographs are being used against them to extort them or to embarrass them or to ruin their reputations. That's against the federal law as well, the same statute. Digital threats. We arrested someone in a courthouse in Wilmington during a murder-for-hire trial because he was on his mobile device on Facebook threatening the witness who was on the stand. And we were able to track it down and actually take him out of the courthouse. Cops being targeted for murder. This was a posting on Instagram on the morning of the shooting of the 2 police officers in New York from the man down in Baltimore who said he was retaliating for some of the police shootings that had occurred. And actually, the Baltimore police were able to get this up to New York into the hands of New York authorities to try to prevent this from happening. They didn't know exactly who was going to target, but unfortunately, it came about 40 minutes too late. So it goes on and on and on. I know I'm out of time. I want to leave time for questions either now or during the reception. So I'm going to cut it off there and ask if there's anyone who has any questions. Oh. None? Yeah, oh, okay. So.
Given the current threat climate, the cyber threat climate you talked about, what are your views on encryption technology that doesn't have reach back to the company, such as like Apple's reluctance to give back information to you?
All right. Wait, I got to show you my my Stormtrooper slide. Those were the droids we were looking for. It's all about mobile. I'm getting to something to play for you because that's a great question. Now you have to tell everybody though that you are not a plant. Encryption is an incredibly complicated issue because on the one hand, in the data security world, we're saying encrypt everything. It makes it more secure, right? Well, if we make it really secure, law enforcement may not be able to access it if there's a need to access it to solve crimes or to prevent additional crimes. And that is a real dilemma for us. I'm going to show you what hackers have to say. I'm going to let you listen to what a group of hackers have to say, and I'm going to apologize now because there's going to be the F words. So if that offends anyone, I'm just going to let you know. But I think it's important for you to hear this.
Like, at that point, fuck encryption. Just open up your hard drive, throw it in a lake. That's the best encryption you can get.
If you encrypt it right, they're not going to find anything.
If you encrypt it right, they're not going to find anything. That was a team of hackers that were reviewing an indictment of members of Anonymous and talking about their own operational security and talking about how they had to immediately revise all of their encryption protocols on their devices because they were afraid that if they were targeted, that was their only way of surviving. So this is a really complicated question. Child sex offenders talking about encryption and getting rid of their collection of images of child sexual abuse until they can secure it with military-grade encryption. These are the type, and what if the information that's encrypted in that device is about the location of a child or the ongoing abuse of a child? Somebody who we might be able to save if we have access to that information. Because in a decade of doing cybercrime investigations, what I've learned is it's not just about redressing past crimes. We are working to prevent future crimes, and we have the ability to do it. And we have the ability to do things like save children and save people from terrorist events. But we need access to that information. So I don't have the answer to your question other to say it's really complicated. Anything else? Yeah. Yes, absolutely. They can be. The question is there a mechanism that allows an independent arbiter to review a set of information that says that information should be able to be accessed now? Because we have reason to believe that it is going to lead us to the discovery of crimes, or it's going to enable us to protect the national security. So you're talking about a balance. And it's important, though, to note that you have this independent review. You have a court standing between, even in the foreign surveillance context, you have a court that is ordering the release of this information. But yeah, it's absolutely the case. There's an absolute tension and a growing tension between surveillance and security and privacy and civil rights. And we need to find that balance. Well, thank you all very much. Do you have a question? I'm happy to answer it.
Yeah, just because of your perspective as an attorney, I'm curious, like in the light of the Snowden cases, do you feel that there was government overreach in what they've done when it comes to surveillance? Because a lot of that, I think it's public reaction to that realization that's caused
Yeah.
push for surveillance.
I don't know if I'd go so far as to say there's overreach, because ultimately the analysis of the data is only pursuant to a court order. I think where the issue comes in is it's one of collecting the data and then using the data. And a concept that runs throughout constitutional jurisprudence in the search context, in the privacy context, is one of particularity, a particularized need for certain information. And my question is, was there enough of a showing of particularity to allow access to that information? And I think that's a really important question and a debatable question. But I think it might also be the solution to some of these issues as we go forward. Because there is no question, the government is going to be held to the standard of, anytime something happens, why wasn't that prevented? What could we have done to prevent that? Did you have the information to prevent that? Did you fail to see the signs? So that's the standard we're up against, and we have to be right 100% of the time.
Well, I'd like you again to join me in thanking Ed for a great lecture today. And also I'd like to say that we have a reception following this at the front of DuPont Hall, so we hope you all can join us for a little bit more conversation. Again, thank you.
You're welcome. One last point for you students. The president announced today $19 billion for cybersecurity. What this means for all of you is jobs. There are lots of jobs that are going to be available, and even for those of us who are a little more up there, it's never too late. So thank you all very much.